Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Jim Knight on the secrets of great instructional coaching, lessons learned from 20 years of research. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to my colleague from Corwin, Maura Sullivan, Director of Marketing Strategy and Business Development, to introduce today's presenter.
Thanks, Jeff, and hello, everyone. By this time, Jim Knight needs no introduction, but I'll provide one anyway. He is the preeminent authority on instructional coaching, having written the very first article on the topic back in 2007, and more than a half dozen professional books since then, including the recently published Impact Cycle. As research associate at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning, and as president of the Instructional Coaching Group, Jim has spent more than 2 decades studying professional learning, effective teaching, and instructional coaching. For more information on Jim's consulting services and many workshops and institutes, be sure to check out instructionalcoaching.com. Before we get started, because of the size of today's crowd, we won't be in a position to field any questions, but you can either send the questions via the chat box for follow-up by Jim later, or email Jim directly at hello@instructionalcoaching.com. So enjoy the webinar, and I will now officially pass you over to Jim.
Hi, everybody. It's a beautiful day in Kansas today, and I'm excited to talk about this topic. It's almost exactly the 20th anniversary of the first presentation I gave at the American Educational Research Association about professional development. So it seems like a good time to look back and say, what is all that research and what does it say? And then I want to draw lessons from each of the studies we've done, which I think could apply to professional development. I have to admit, I'm not a great fan of webinars. So I'm hoping you're sitting somewhere quietly with maybe a glass of wine, looking at the sun out the windows, but maybe you're sitting in a room with a bunch of other people, seeing if you can sneak in some email too. I don't know. But nonetheless, I am very happy to share this information. It's been my life's work. It's been to try to figure out what does it look like to provide the most effective professional development for teachers in a way that honors the professionalism of teachers. And so I'd like to share this journey sort of for the first time I've ever sort of gone through this in this kind of format. If you want to learn more about the research, if you go to instructionalcoaching.com/research, there's a pretty complete bibliography there and links to many of the papers. And by a week from Friday, there will be a really comprehensive list of papers that you can download. And everything I'm going to describe here, you should be able to find the paper. And all the studies I'm going to describe here, I think, have gone through peer review, which is to say it's not just my opinion. Research is important. It's not perfect, but it's important because it removes some of the confirmation bias. We tend to like the things that we create, especially when we get paid for them. And research through peer review is a way to check and say, does this really hold up to the standards of what good research looks like? And so most of these things were presented at the American Educational Research Association. Some of them have gone through peer review for papers as well. This is I hesitated to look at this picture. This is a picture from about 1992 when I was first teaching. And I work with students with learning disabilities. And I really didn't know what I was going to do, but I had a coach, Dee LaFrance, a dear, dear friend of mine who really was my mentor in the early years. And Dee taught me about an approach called the strategic instruction model. And it's about teaching kids how to learn, and especially in my case, I was using it for writing. And it worked like a charm. I started out as a sessional. I got a full-time job. I got an award for the job, and I got evidence that it was really working. I even wrote a paper about the impact of that class. And when you work with students who struggle and you see success, I think you want to spread the word, because it's powerful to watch a student who didn't think they could write learn how to write, and that be a kind of hinge point in their lives where they start to see other things that are possible. They realize they have control over their learning. Writing is so wonderful for that. So I became a trainer in this approach called the strategic instruction model, read a couple dozen research papers, went to Kansas for a week. I was living in Toronto at the time. started to do training, which is the term we would have used back then, and I had zero impact. People, evaluations were positive, but there was no evidence that anybody implemented anything. So I became consumed with the question of what's it take to get implementation. I studied with Michael Fullen at the University of Toronto for a couple courses. He was kind enough to give me an independent study, and since then he's really been another person who's deeply influenced my life. And then I came to Kansas, and I was kind of consumed with the question, why is it we do workshops and people don't implement the practices? And I did a number of studies, and I want to sort of walk through them one to one. And the first one has got a title I probably wouldn't use today, but back when I was young and foolish, I adopted the title. The title is a quote from a teacher, though I should qualify this. And the quote is, "Another damn thing we got to do, teacher perceptions of professional development." I presented it at AERA in 2000, and it was really a case study that captured some of the things I was finding by interviewing teachers. I estimate about 300 teachers. It became a part of the way I did professional development. And I found that teachers' expectations for professional development, now I think they're higher now than they were then, but they were pretty low. This particular case study, I did a workshop and it all fell apart. And there was arguments and people in tears, and I thought, well, this is, as a researcher, this is really interesting. So I went back and I interviewed everybody in the workshop to try to figure out what was going on. And I found certain things. First off, I put one person together with another person. They hadn't talked to each other for 5 years. And there was a history of interpersonal conflict in this session. Most people had really low expectations for professional development. They felt overwhelmed by all the things they had to do. They had resentment that they didn't really have a voice in this professional development. And there were changes taking place in their schools that they didn't know how to deal with, but the workshop wasn't really addressing their concerns. So they saw the workshop as irrelevant, and things all kind of fell apart. To capture the essence of what people said, I created vignettes, little stories. This paper you can download online. And this is one of the vignettes. This is just one person I talked to. I've edited this text so it sounds like a narrative. It wasn't written exactly like this, but this is all the person's words that I interviewed. She said this. She said, talking about a learning strategies presentation, which is exactly the kind of presentations I gave. The person I interviewed said this: the presenter made so many of us so angry by our attitude, probably as much as anything. We were doing it during, really, I don't know if it was fall or spring, but the weather was extremely hot and we really didn't have any air-conditioned anything in this building at the time. It was at the end of the day when you're really tired and we weren't being paid for it at all. We'd be here until way after 4, and the building would be empty by the time, we'd finish. I'm not really sure people function well if they're mentally and physically tired. She may have had a much better audience if we'd been rested. She would come in and she would always talk about her experiences, her family, how all of this was very possible and how it would be very beneficial. She always looked so fresh, so clean. She had this honey-colored hair, very attractive. She sparkled with jewelry, gold jewelry. I've never seen anybody wear more jewelry than this person did. It was so tasteful. She looked good. And all of us felt absolutely so grubby, just really nastily. We really weren't very receptive to her. I think we sat around looking like hostile juvenile delinquents. I'm sure we did. We were hostile, giving dirty looks, looking at each other, all this hostile stuff. It's embarrassing to think about, a bit amusing maybe, but mostly embarrassing. But I think probably the thing I didn't like, because I just don't believe it. I don't believe there's any one system that's perfect. And this was sold to us as being something that we had to do step by step, no deviation. There could be none of our personal input into working with an individual child. It was very cut and very dried, and it was nothing you could deviate from. And that irritated me. It was as if you absolutely had no brain, that you didn't know what might work better using the same basic idea. There was no possibility at all, none whatsoever. Well, I could see the strategies would be really very effective with some children. I knew it wouldn't work for everybody. And could you change it? No was the answer we got. You could not. This was it. It had been tested. You could not change it, and she was really quite adamant about that. She didn't bend anything. You had to follow those instructions exactly. It was probably a combination of many things. At any rate, after she finished her stint here, I think most of us tucked the books away that our district bought for us and just never used them. And there's, at the heart of this particular vignette, there's something going on that really consumed me in my first years at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning. which is the nature of my relationship with teachers. And this isn't about me, but it could have been about me because this is the approach I took. It had to be done exactly the way the research said. Didn't honor the professionalism of teachers. And it off-put teachers. And it was one of the main reasons I found in these interviews that teachers didn't embrace professional development because their expertise wasn't recognized and valued. So I became kind of consumed with the fact that we needed a different approach. Some of the lessons I learned from this study were that follow-up is really essential. And so a one-off workshop is not going to particularly work. But one of the things that surprisingly I learned was that one-to-one conversations are really powerful. When I went back to interview everybody, I made a connection with everybody I interviewed. And when I came back to do a subsequent presentation, their evaluations were really positive. There was a real change. And I wrote about this in the book, Instructional Coaching. So one lesson, one-to-one is powerful. And one lesson is we need a different model for interaction. And that's what I began to study with the second study, and that's the study on partnership learning, which actually ended up being my dissertation. Although I presented this before, I presented the other case study. This was a ARA 1999. This study actually came after the interviews. And what I was experimenting with this study was a different approach to working with teachers, a partnership approach. And I wanted to compare the model described in that case. You had to do it cut and dry. It had been tested, no deviation, with an approach where I honored the professionalism of teachers by by working from a set of principles that have come to be called the partnership principles. I used an approach called a counterbalance design. And now, counterbalance design, if you look at this little diagram, you've got two groups, and one group did visual imagery in the first session, self-questioning in the second session. Group B, same thing, visual imagery in the first session, self-questioning in the second session. And Group A had the partnership approach in the first session, and Group B had the partnership approach in the second session. So if there's a difference, it's not because of when it was, because one group got it in the first session, one group got it in the second session. And it's not because of the strategy, because one group got visual imagery and one group got self-questioning, both reading comprehension strategies. If there's a difference, we've controlled pretty much for everything. And so this is why I love this counterbalance design. If there's a difference, it's probably because of the approach. And there was a difference. We wanted to see, did people learn more? Were they more likely to implement? Were they more engaged? Did they enjoy themselves more in one workshop more than the other? And what we found is there was a statistically significant, actually a very large difference in each case. We gave people a knowledge test. There was a statistically difference in how much they learned in the partnership approach versus the more basic fidelity approach. We asked them a question. Now that you learned two strategies, which one are you more likely to implement? There was a form they filled in to document their level of engagement, and then there was a workshop evaluation, all ways of measuring these different research questions. Like I said, all of them showed a big difference in what they learned. But this is just the workshop evaluation for comprehension. And you can see the scores, how different they are for the partnership approach versus the traditional approach. And this is workshop evaluation for engagement. Again, you can see the difference in the scores. This is enjoyment, and you can see the difference. And this is an enjoyment form. It says, but it really should be the engagement form. And there was a dramatic difference in engagement. And then we asked people, well, now that you've learned two different strategies, which one are you more likely to implement? And there's a difference of 4.5 to 1. The partnership approach had 59 people who wanted to implement the strategy, and the more fidelity approach, 14 people who wanted to implement the strategy. So what was going on there? Well, we were working from a set of principles, and the difference likely was the way in which we approach people. One of the principles is the principle of equality. And of all the work I've done in my 20 years of doing this work, it's probably these principles that people have resonated the most with and given me the most feedback about. So equality is not saying that we are the same, it's saying that we count the same. And it means you're not communicating to someone that you think you're better than them. You're communicating to someone that I see the value in you. And, just think about the difference between talking to somebody who you think thinks is better than you and talking to someone who you think really sees your worth. And equality is about really seeing the value and the worth in the other person. The second thing is choice. And choice is a complex thing, and I suggest you read more about it, because in a little webinar like this, we can't say an awful lot about it. But the idea is, as I've often said, is when you insist, people will resist. And the idea with choice is that, of course, not everything's a choice. You can't say, I'm kind of not a morning person, I'm going to start teaching at 11. That's not going to fly. And there are certain things you have to do. And I should say these partnership principles work from the assumption that the person's being professional. If someone's acting in a non-professional way, let's say bullying kids, that has to be dealt with directly. But if we really want commitment, you probably need choice. If there isn't a chance in which people can say that their brains are engaged in the learning, you're probably not going to get a high level of commitment. The third is voice. And Gallup organization has identified voice as one of the key elements, 12 key elements for an effective work situation. People are more engaged, more productive, and more successful when they have a voice. And Shane Lopez then did a study on voice and found that teachers basically don't feel they have a voice. They were the lowest on his list of people he studied. And then Russ Quaglia studied student voice and teacher voice. And he found that when kids have a voice, they're 7 times more likely to succeed. And that kids have a voice pretty much only when teachers have a voice. He said at our conference a couple of years ago, he said, when teachers have a voice, kids have a voice. And when kids have a voice, they're 7 times more likely to succeed. And then another principle is kind of putting those pieces together. The principle of dialogue is the idea that I'm engaged in a conversation where your brain and my brain are equally important, and we're sharing ideas back and forth. I'm not trying to talk you into anything. I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to help us do right. And so we're thinking together. It's a meeting of the minds. And there's, in fact, the way I approach the person, I should be humble and open to hearing a different perspective. I want to do the right thing, so I want us to make sure we do that. So let's think together in this thinking partnership. And that partnership involves reflection. And often that means looking back, looking ahead. But as I said, we are thinking together, we're exploring things together, and we're focused on real life application of our learning. It's learning by doing when we take the partnership approach, learning grounded in the real life needs of teachers and students. Not a workshop, but a genuine, how do we make this work in today's class? When you have praxis engaged, at least as I define it, I have a kind of narrow definition of praxis, but when you have this real life learning happening, there should be full engagement on the part. There's no resistance. The two of us are just trying to figure out what to do. And that leads to the last one, which is reciprocity. The old idea is when one teaches, two learn. And another way of putting it is we approach others not as judges, but as learners. We see every interaction with another person as a chance to learn. Brad Statz, in his most recent book about learning, he says, we should approach other people recognizing that everybody knows something we don't know, and we should try to get that. We should try to figure out what is it they don't learn. So the first thing was to look at professional development, and we found that people had a pretty low opinion, and part of the problem was the relationship with people. So then we studied in the second study the partnership approach, and we found that when we position teachers as professionals, when we offer them real choices, when we engage in real dialogue, and when their voices are heard, they're 4.5 times more likely to embrace the things we're sharing. And that led to the next area of research, which was looking at how do we work one-to-one with teachers. So in 1998, I published this little article in the University of Kansas study called Learning Consulting, about translating and research into practice. And learning consulting was the first term we used for what we came to call instructional coaching. We recognized the need for one-to-one, face-to-face professional development, and we just were figuring it out back then. We really didn't have any, we thought, let's just go in there and see what happens. But as time evolved, we started to pin down some things that have to happen in professional development for it to follow up. And so in 2004, I printed this article or published this article with the Journal of Staff Development. Initially, it was going to be instructional collaborators make progress through partnership. But before I submitted that article, I'd given quite a few presentations. People kept saying to me, you know, you're really not collaborators, you're coaches. And so I switched the name to coach from collaborator. And for many years, I was pretty happily thinking we'd invented the term instructional coach. And well, we had, but it had also been invented back in 1990 something. There was an article about instructional coaches in US military schools. In fact, if you have that article, I'd love to find it. So the first known use of that term, I think, was back about 1990 something. Anyway, this article was the first article in Journal of Staff Development to talk about instructional coaching. We started to lay out some things about what it should look like, and then as time progressed, I eventually published this book, Instructional Coaching, which really did lay out several important lessons we were learning about instructional coaching. There's real power in one-to-one. There's real power in dialogue. It's important to be very, very clear with your practices, even though you're approaching the person in a dialogical way. And for that, we really believe in the power of checklists. And important to model practices so people can see it. We didn't have a really rich idea of what modeling looked like when this book was published, but we knew it was really important to learn something. People say, I want to see what it looks like. We started to have an emerging understanding of the importance of a small number of teaching practices, what we called the Big Four, which was planning, assessment, instruction, formative assessment. There was a chapter on that. We knew about the power and importance of effective communication, what in that book I call partnership communication. And we knew about the importance of leadership, especially being respectful to others, giving them choices. When I wrote this book, there were no other books on instructional coaching. This is, I think, the first book that featured it in the title. And it was really hard to find articles. I could find some work about coaching. Joellen Killian had a book that I like. Steve Barkley had a book that I have covered with Post-it notes. Marshall Goldsmith had written a lot about coaching, but executive coaching. Coactive coaching was out then. But instructional coaching, I couldn't really find anything. And this became, I guess that old saying is, if you can't find the book you want to read, you have to write it. And that's kind of what happened here. We did a study of this. We did many different studies along the way. In instructional coaching, there's kind of informal studies, but the rigorous study I did with Jake Cornett. We presented that at AERA in 2009. And we had a workshop. Half the people in the workshop got coaching, half the people didn't. And they would determine randomly. We literally pulled names out of a hat. And the people who got coaching got the kind of coaching described in instructional coaching. It described clear explanations, modeling, follow-up, those kinds of things. And the difference was pretty dramatic. Everybody who came to the workshop wanted to implement. We interviewed everybody before they came. And they all came to learn about this approach called the unit organizer, a way of making what kids are going to learn clear through a graphic organizer. Research on the unit organizer was developed by Keith Lentz at the University of Kansas, said that it would have a big impact, especially on kids with learning disabilities, to make the classes accessible. And so they all wanted to do it. We had all these teachers come to the workshop, and then we had our army of research assistants go in and observe the class. And I should point out today, of all days, that this funding was largely through GERA. We had some school improvement grants to help us with our work too, in Topeka, Kansas, home of Brown versus Board of Education. But GERA, which I just saw as on the chopping block for funding, is what allowed us to do this work. And if you're influenced by the work we've done on instructional coaching, it's probably because of GERA. So keep in mind that the funding now is in a tenuous situation, and it's GERA that allowed us to do this work. Well, what did we find when we did the study? Well, we found that people who were coached were more likely to implement. 87% of the coached people use a unit organizer versus 33%. And this is not their opinion. We went in and had observers go in blind to what was happening, and they objectively observed the classes to see what was happening. And in terms of quality of implementation, we had a checklist for what it would look like for teachers to implement effectively. And those who were coached, as you can see, we're much closer to, the list was out of 10, but those who were coached had much higher quality implementation than and those who weren't coached. I would have liked it to have been even higher in the coach group, but still this is what we got. Then we said, did you continue to use it? And it was 68% versus 18% for the coach group. And we said, will you use it in the future? It happened that we asked this question around assessment time, so not everybody was using it. But to that, it was 96% to 35%. So almost everyone who was coached intended to continue to use it, whereas the uncoached group was a lot smaller. So we did other studies around the impact of coaching, some of them not rigorous enough for peer review. We gathered data on just who implemented after workshops, if they didn't get coaching or they did get coaching, and there was a pretty dramatic difference in terms of implementation. I wrote about that in Instructional Coaching. But we wanted to develop a different approach to coaching, and so we came to focus more on what we call lean design research. Lean design research is a combination of a book called The Lean Startup and the general notion of doing design research. And for this, we were fortunate to get an IES grant and some other funding. And we worked mostly with coaches in Beaverton, Oregon, and Othello, Washington. And the way it worked is they would try out the coaching process, implement it, and then we would try to identify where there was some kind of friction point or roadblock. And then we try to fix that, and then we'd repeat the process and do the same thing over and over again. In about 3 years, we went through 11 cycles of the coaching cycle, identifying where there were roadblocks and inventing improvements. And many of the things that are in the book, The Impact Cycle, grew out of that research. We learned about the power of peers' goals, that goals are powerful, emotionally compelling, easy, in the sense that we picked the simplest and most direct path to the goal. Reachable, we can measure it, and we have a student-focused goal. And a reachable goal has also got a strategy to help us get there. By a student-focused goal, I don't necessarily mean that we're addressing standards. What I mean is we're addressing what's most pressing for students. One of the things we came to learn as well is that coaching, from our perspective, is not just about achievement. Achievement, of course, it stands at the heart of a lot of what we want to do. I'm right now just almost finished a paper on visible learning and instructional coaching, talking about how instructional coaching could be a vehicle for visible learning. I'll probably have it out within a week or two. But the thing about engagement is when you look at the literature on why students drop out, they don't drop out because of achievement, they drop out because of engagement. In particular, emotional engagement. They don't feel a connection with the school. And so as we wrote this book, we had a growing understanding that engagement involves behavior, that's time on task, but it also involves authentic engagement, as Phil Schlechte says, or cognitive engagement, which is their brains are involved. And it also involves emotional engagement. The kids feel a connection with the school, that they feel the learning is meaningful and purposeful, that they have friends in school, that they have hope. And there are little assessments in the back of the impact cycle, many of them on the companion website for the impact cycle that allow you to assess those things, at least in a provisional way. Some other stuff we learned was that modeling could be done in lots of different ways. And it could be going to watch another teacher. It could be watching a teacher on video. We even learned that the kind of modeling we were doing wasn't working too well. We used to go into classrooms where behavior was the problem. We learned really in working with the coaches in Beaverton that modeling for behavior doesn't make much sense, because if you succeed, you erode the teacher's power base. And if you don't succeed, you can just say, well, I feel your pain, but there's not a lot to be learned. And so we think actually going to see another teacher or watching a video or perhaps co-teaching are other ways of addressing modeling. And one of the big things that came out of this, and I describe it in the impact cycle, and there's going to be more coming on this soon, is the importance of an instructional playbook, of identifying exactly what are the core strategies you use and how to describe those strategies, summarizing what the research says in very simple documents. Because if you can't clearly describe the practice, people aren't going to learn it. And to me, the instructional playbook is a missing link in professional development. We have these workshops, we have ways of explaining things, we have books that are theoretical. But if I'm a teacher, I want to know, how do I actually do it? And if you take the partnership approach, you can describe it precisely while recognizing the need for the teacher to make sense of it. You say, we want to be precise but provisional. Other things that came out of the impact cycle research were the power of video, and how many people we've worked with who started to use video as a part of coaching now say, I can't even imagine coaching without video. And another big thing that came out of it was the power of interviewing students, asking students for their take on the class. To me, students are the great untapped resource for instructional coaching. Well, we wanted to see if it was working too. So our lean design research methodology helped us improve the process and integrate video and set effective questions and use checklists more effectively, change the way we do modeling, develop an instructional playbook, all things that are described in the book. But did it work? So we did what's called a multiple baseline design, and I'll show you how it works. David Knight was the chief author on this, who just might be related to me, but now he's doing amazing things at UTEP down south there. And what we found as a part of our project where we were doing the work in Othello, Washington, I think, no, this was Beaverton where we did the research, is that coaching had a big impact. Now, a multiple baseline design is a study, and you can download this online, but it's a study where you intervene at different points for different people. And so maybe the first person gets coaching after 4 weeks, the next person gets it after 8 weeks, the next person gets it after 12 weeks. And you want to see, is there a difference in every person's situation? And if you see it over and over again, after coaching, the scores go up. After coaching, the scores go up. After coaching, the scores go up. That happens every time we had 8 different teachers. Then you feel pretty confident that the difference is coaching. It's not chance. I think multiple baseline is another great design for doing educational research. Anyway, in every case, the difference were pretty dramatic. We went in, again, with research assistants who were blind to what was happening. They didn't know who had been coached and who hadn't. They observed what was happening in the classroom. And then we looked at the observations to say what happened before and after coaching. Nobody was asked for their opinion. It was merely observation on the part of the researchers. And what we saw was a pretty profound difference. This is one teacher who was focused on formative assessment. And before and after coaching, the light blue is before coaching. The dark blue is after coaching, and there's several weeks in between each dot. And pretty much in every situation, this is kind of how it worked. This one happens to be after 11 weeks. This is after 5 weeks. This is after 10 weeks. This is after 13 weeks. But each teacher, we saw a difference like this. Before coaching, after coaching, there was something pretty dramatic. And we also gathered data on time on task, and you can see the form we used in the paper, and calculated an effect size. And the effect size was pretty significant. It was 1.03 in terms of the impact the coaches had on student engagement, calculating time on task. One more study we did, and there aren't that many more. We're getting closer to finish in case you're like, goodness gracious. But one more study is what we call the Great Coaches Study. My colleagues and I worked with a partnership with the state of Florida at a time when they had a project called Just Read Florida. There were 2,000 coaches across the state of Florida. And we met with the state, and they had 35, I think, supervisors across the state. And so we brought together the supervisors. We said, we need you to identify a bunch of great coaches. We got over 30 great coaches identified. And then we narrowed those great coaches down to a group of 5. And the group of 5 we wanted to sort of make sure we had people that represented different economic sections and different culture and reflected not just sort of suburban school districts. And then 9 of us went down and we did interviews, and we'd interview the coach, the teachers of the coach, the principal, the supervisor of the coach, person who worked for Just Read Florida. In fact, we interviewed the coach twice. All those interviews were transcribed. They were loaded into a program called In Vivo. And then we went through the stacks of information to see if we'd identified key things. And then we brought together coaches and say, do these seem accurate to do? What's called a member check, to make sure the data we gathered was effective. This study was presented at ARA in 2010. We found a few things about what separated good coaches from great coaches. And one of the things was that the great coaches were really skillful at interpersonal communication. People trusted them. And one person I interviewed said she was the first person I met with when I came to the school. And so they had a lot of interpersonal strengths. They were also really effective communicators. They were helping people learn practices and learning how to do the work they did. They could communicate that effectively. They had useful stuff that they could share with teachers. This is one of the reasons we believe in the idea of an instructional playbook. They could give tools to teachers to help the teachers hit their goals. So as we said, a wide range of skills, resources, and strategies. And they were ambitious for change, but also highly respectful of teachers. One of the findings was that, and I don't know if I like this or not, but it is a finding, was that the teachers, the coaches who were most effective were really, really hard workers. They really stayed late. One principal said, I'm the first person in the school and the last person out of the school, except for one other person, and that's the coach. So I suppose one way of putting that is they were deeply committed to doing what's best for kids. So all those studies together have been at the heart of the research we've done. And I want to do just a quick overview of the books that have been published because I see them as a suite of tools for instructional coaches. And then I'll turn it back to Maura. But to me, the story has evolved bit by bit, and it continues to evolve. We're learning new things all the time. We're getting really clear on how to help school districts develop instructional playbooks, for example, and that's a really, really important thing. We're getting clearer and clearer on how to evaluate coaches effectively, at least instructional coaches. And the model keeps evolving. It's now a more dynamic way of understanding the coaching conversations. We see coaching more like improv, like improvisational comedy, or like ping pong. I can't pong until you ping. And so it's this back and forth. It's not a really structured, there's a structure to it, but the coach has to be able to improvise and play off the other person in order to be most effective in their questioning. We're also expanding kind of our library of questions that we're learning from coaches as we keep refining our work, and we're always looking for people to be learning partners, especially school districts who want to be a part of our research. Anyway, here's the suite of books that are the result of all that work. Like I said, you can find our research at instructionalcoaching.com. Within the next 2 weeks, there'll be a pretty significant upgrade, but even now you can see the references and download some articles. Here are the books, and I'll just talk about them briefly. The impact cycle describes the process we follow. If you're going to be a coach, you have to have some way to know what you're doing. And so the impact cycle is also packed with tons of resources, about 100 forms you can download. Many of them are online on the companion site. But I think the impact cycle is kind of like where you start. You have to have some way of doing what you do. And it's the result of those 11 iterations and the previous work we did. It took us 20 years to come up with something as simple as identify, learn, and improve as our coaching process. Better Conversations is a study was done in 2011, another one in 2015. I didn't mention these because they weren't particularly rigorous. We were just testing out the ideas in the book. But it's about the nature of the relationship you have with people. And many people, when they watch themselves on video, are kind of surprised to see how much advice they give, how much they struggle to not interrupt, how much of the talking they do. And Better Conversations, a set of beliefs, quite similar to the partnership beliefs, principles. And it's a set of habits for communication, like demonstrating empathy, redirecting toxic conversations, finding common ground, fostering trust, those kinds of things. High impact instruction is our best bet at putting together the raw resources for an instructional playbook. If you're a coach, you need tools to help you implement your strategies, and high impact instruction is the way you do it. Then Focus on Teaching is a book about how to use video in professional learning. Video to me is like a jet engine was for transportation. Video, the micro camera is like what Napster was to music. It's one of the three most important things in our life as far as professional development goes. It's transforming professional development. Like I said, I can't see coaching unless the coach, I guess you could coach without video, but video really, really is helpful. Then Unmistakable Impact is the clearest articulation of the partnership principles and what I call the complexities of helping, and talks about how those principles apply to many different forms of professional development. Instructional Coaching was the first book. It's still really helpful, particularly in terms of coaches as leaders and spreading ideas around a school system. And Coaching Approaches and Perspectives is articles from many people about different approaches to coaching, including Randy Sprick, Joellen Killian, Lucy West, Kathy Toll, and I've got a couple articles in there too, and there's some other authors who all generously contributed to the book, and it's a book if you wanted to get a perspective on coaching. I wish I could say I had an easier way to translate ideas into practice. I wish there was a simple way, but I don't know the simple way. I've been struggling with this for 20 years. Back when I first started, I had proven practices, and I wanted to get them in the hands of teachers, and I didn't know how. And what I've learned is it takes a partnership. It takes precision. It takes support. And yet, when you have those things in place, when you have a process to follow, and when you communicate effectively and you have tools that make a difference, it's powerfully positive. And people want to learn. They just don't want to be dehumanized in the process of learning. But if their voices count, if they have some choice, if they get tools that help them reach more kids and save them time, that's not a pain. That's a really positive thing. And if we want to change the cultures of the schools to have them be the places our kids deserve, it's probably going to start with a coach. So that's about all I've got to say. I'm going to turn it back to Maura. And thank you all for listening. If anybody stuck it out till the end, good for you. I like that persistence. So back to you, Maura. Thank you.
Well, everyone has stuck it out to the end, Jim, and thank you very, very much for this. We all look forward to what the next 20 years of research from you comes to reveal. Just a quick note to the entire group. We've received lots of queries about the recorded session and the PowerPoints. If you opted in, which means when you registered, they will automatically be sent to you. If for some reason you didn't, I would suggest that you reach out by next Monday, wait until next Monday, to sophia.duva@corwin.com. That's spelled SOPHIA.duva@corwin.com, DUVA. And also your certificate, PD certificate of attendance, will be sent at the very same time. And we're absolutely delighted to offer 20% savings across any or all books in Jim's professional book library. One quick caveat that I'm not for his bundles because the 20% discount is already in place. So thank you all for joining us, and enjoy your evening, and thank you, Jim. Oh, I'm sorry, one quick thing. Any questions, reach out to Jim directly at hello@instructionalcoaching.com. And thank you, and enjoy your evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maura.